Goeiedag, good day, everybody, and welcome back to yet another episode of the Constitution at Work podcast, brought to you by the F.W. de Klerk Foundation, dedicated to making our constitutional democracy a reality for all South Africans. Today, we're joined by our host of interns, Sia, Shaun, Ezra, and a very special guest who we thank for giving us a piece of her time, Professor Jo-Ansie van Wyk, a lecturer of the University of South Africa. Professor is a professor of international relations at the university, and she's a maverick in the field of nuclear diplomacy. She's also an author of various books on foreign policy. So, Prof, we welcome you.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Prof, if we could just touch on you, your personal experiences, what got you interested in the field of foreign policy, geopolitics, international relations, and how has being a maverick in the field in South Africa shaped your views?
Thank you very much for that. And I must go back to your foundation and President de Klerk, because that was the time when I have gained my real interest in politics round about the late 80s, when there were talks about the changes that is coming in our country. And of course, by the time that he became president in 1989, clearly there were a lot of changes going on, and that grappled my imagination and of course got me into studying political science. But besides that, I come from a family that is always interested in history and discussions. And of course, having gone through a very exciting time as a South African, I cannot imagine that one is not engaged in politics. It's almost like it's a national sport besides soccer and rugby. And it is always for me that the personal is political and vice versa. And also it's a civic duty to be engaged in our politics and to be a responsible citizen and also be part of the civic conversation that takes place in our society.
Absolutely. And Prof, you mentioned something very important there, and that's leadership and ethical leadership as well. And I just want to ask you, from your vantage point, growing up and going through the ranks, how do you view President F.W. de Klerk's role in voluntarily disarming as something that can now be emulated throughout the world?
Well, as we know, that has been a very tricky decision to make at the time. Tricky in the sense that how do you convince, on the one hand, the military, the other hand, the scientists that are there, and of course the cabinet that President de Klerk oversaw at that stage. But it seems from his own speeches, his own writings, the conferences that he participated in, that there was a deep conviction at the time that these are what we now call weapons of mass destruction that can in no way be part of a peace dividend that South Africa was working at the time. So when the changes came into that psyche of the individual, that was then when these changes could take place. And the fact that nuclear weapons are by no means an insurance policy. In fact, President de Klerk is on record for saying that there was never the intention to use these weapons simply for deterrence. Now, clearly, our country's case show that diplomacy, negotiation is a way forward. And also what is important is the emulation of our process is that you do not lose when you give up your weapons. In fact, you gain a lot of international prestige. A lot of our scientists are working all over the world, and a lot of our diplomats have gained huge standing and status and prestige at the UN and elsewhere for the work that they've done during that time when we had to verify the disarmament of South Africa. And now we see that South Africa is one of two countries, the other one being Ukraine, that has voluntarily given up nuclear weapons. And of course, we know that the specter of nuclear devastation remains. There are still about 13,000 nuclear weapons in the world. And of course, we see countries that are also very ambitious in terms of their own nuclear weapons program. And one can only imagine that if you are outside the international treaties, which President de Klerk led us into, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the safeguards agreements with the IAEA, if you are outside that, you cannot be controlled, so to speak, and you become then an irresponsible global citizen, which we as South Africans continue to be since we gave up our nuclear weapons.
Absolutely, Prof. And you mentioned there that the leadership offered by both President Nelson Mandela and President F.W. de Klerk was hailed as victory for diplomacy and negotiation, which in part led to them winning the Nobel Peace Prize jointly. But that was also accompanied by a whole host of international agreements and covenants that South Africa had entered into. Foremost is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Treaty of Pelindaba, which, as I understand, created an African nuclear-free zone. But you also mentioned there that you still have, even today, a whole host of countries that sit outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Do you think that this has affected the trajectory for peace? And, if we look at the Middle East specifically, do we know the status of countries like Israel having nuclear weapons, Iran's provocations on Israel? Could that possibly lead to countries that are either within or without the Non-Proliferation Treaty entering into possibly nuclear war again? Or have we entered a period where we just have to contend with mutually assured destruction and use nuclear weapons as a deterrent?
Well, that is a huge question. And of course, the question that you raise is the very one that we would like to prevent. The fact that there is so much weapons around. So besides weapons of mass destruction, we also have the problem of small arms and light weapons and the proliferation thereof. But let's stick to the topic of the day. So what we see is that when South Africa signed the NPT, of course, as you mentioned, we were also then at that stage the state that determined the future of the Treaty of Pelindaba, that came out of the OAU. And then, of course, after the African Union was established, that was one of the reasons why the treaty could be negotiated, because we have experience in dismantling our weapons program, and our diplomats were also up to the task to be able to participate in this African conversation. So that made us a nuclear weapons free zone. But fast forward about 10 years thereafter, we see that South Africa signed onto the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, in effect criminalizing the possession, the development, the storing of nuclear weapons. So there are still a number of countries outside that, and you've mentioned some of that. Countries, even the major nuclear powers, the US, China, France, Britain, that are outside this, because they still see nuclear weapons as that ultimate insurance policy. And as long as there is that MAD that you referred to, the mutually assured destruction, there is, of course, that possibility. But we are very worried about the events that are taking place, of course, within the Middle East and in between Russia and Ukraine. Israel is a country that we do not know how much and how many it has. And of course, countries do not necessarily declare these. And this is one of the problems, is that there is an issue, and we need to have a Middle East zone that is free of weapons of mass destruction. And as we know, as Africans, we also have a role therein, because some of the countries in the north of our continent forms part of that initiative to have a Middle East nuclear weapons free zone. And here Israel is very important, because that is the country, like South Africa was when we signed the Pelindaba Treaty, the holdout state, that can make a difference. And given the current situation that we have in the Middle East, in Israel, Gaza, we are in a big problem, and cool heads should prevail so that there is no red buttons to push.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you, Prof. And I think the thing is, you see, as the FW de Klerk Foundation, we're dedicated to promoting peace, not just within South Africa, but across borders as well. And again, trying to emulate that vision of President FW de Klerk, and hoping to see his legacy fester in all corners of the earth. But we do live in the 21st century, and we have so many different anomalies at play today that were not in existence in the 1990s. I know my colleague Shaun wants to ask a lot of questions on artificial intelligence and so forth.
I'd like to I'll ask a few questions on my side, Prof. Thanks for joining us. I just wanted to ask, with the rise of artificial intelligence, obviously now certain information is at the disposal of non-state actors who wish to perhaps pursue uranium enrichment and the development of a nuclear weapon. What are the dangers of this information being so easily and readily now at the disposal of those who wish to obviously develop nuclear weapons for the wrong purposes? But also, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was I think it was a Senseri report that was released sometime last year to say that after the Wagner Group specifically might have got hold of a nuclear reactor, nuclear reaction material in Ukraine, which they eventually sold to North Korea. I just wanted to, that would bring me to my second question, just ask what are the dangers of that? Will you see now a more active North Korea in pursuing their nuclear weapons program to an even greater extent? And then also, what that brings me to my third question, what would that then mean for Japan and South Korea, who are already paranoid with the North Korean threat in the region? Could they, I know there has been rumors of Japan and South Korea perhaps looking to develop their own nuclear weapons to counter the North Korean threat. I mean, there are two middle powers that certainly do have the capacity to develop those weapons.
Shaun, these are very good questions. First of all, we know that the artificial intelligence developments are, of course, grave concerns. As much as it can be good, we know that it is clearly showing signs that our cybersecurity and our cyber world is constantly changing. Now, the question is, it can only be prevented to fall into, let's say, hands that do not have peaceful use of nuclear energy in mind. How does that happen? In other words, we've seen that at the UN level, there are conventions that are being signed that countries should be more responsible and that everything in their ability should be done in order to prevent AI being used for proliferation and other uses. You may remember that last year, the Prime Minister of Britain had also had an IA summit, which was unprecedented before, because there is a greater awareness of the security risk associated with it. So what we see in terms of the proliferation of material, of goods, of equipment, of even technology and expertise, here it is very important that states participate in the International Atomic Energy Agency's program that tracks these illicit activities. Sadly, this is a voluntary contribution that states make, that they report whatever is happening in their countries. But we see also in terms of Interpol, there are also wide efforts to counter and to look at intelligence that bring to the fore what has been part of these illicit activities. And of course, your question goes then a little bit further, and I like it that you make a broad brushstroke of the global geopolitical scene by using the example of North Korea, South Korea, and Japan. Now, my experience has been that the South Koreans are very interested in what happened in South Africa. In fact, there has been material produced that compare our two countries in terms of negotiating with the enemy, but also then going that extra mile in disarming. So the lessons that we have learned is, of course, to have that open door, to be able to negotiate. And as we know, between the two Koreans, there are, of course, not that open door. Talks that have taken place during the presidency of Donald Trump has stopped, but also there is a sense of distrust between North and South Korea. Now, of course, that creates an insecure environment, not only for South Korea and Japan, but also for some of the other states in the Pacific Ocean. And here, I think we see that the US presence in South Korea, for example, is one of those counter factors that keeps the use of chemical, radiological, and nuclear weapons at bay in that part of the world. But also, North Korea cannot develop this without itself. Countries under severe international pressure, and the South African case have shown it, cannot develop a nuclear weapons capacity on its own. It is simply impossible. It is too expensive. You will have to have expertise and exposure to the international environment to be able to do that, because some equipment needs to be designed, etc. So the international community is probably also complicit in the development of that program of North Korea. And here, non-state actors pose a specific warning to us. In 2004, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1540, which specifically looks at the non-proliferation of chemical, biological, and radiological and nuclear material and weapons and equipment to counter a proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Countries are expected to voluntarily submit reports to that, but in some instances, countries feel that their national security is compromised, or that they do not have the expertise, or that it is not in their national security interest to declare whatever they have on their soil. So it's a tricky question, but I think it is important that the international community be responsible, because a nuclear weapon, whether it's a big one or small one, there is no small nuclear weapon, given the extensive damage that it can do. It is in our existential urgency that we prevent the spread and use and the threats of this weapon. And also now we see that power stations have been weaponized during the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and this adds an additional layer where power stations are now used as weapons. In other words, you use your opponent's own resources against it. And here the international community also have a special obligation in terms of getting the talks ready between Ukraine and Russia. And here again, South Africa continues on its legacy of having difficult conversations, of keeping the door open with our peace initiatives between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah. Now, I think it's very scary, Prof, that we live in times where we sit on a very delicate balance between having nuclear non-proliferation and proliferation, where even the smallest nuclear weapon today, as you say, is still many, many times bigger than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so, I just want to delve into whether you think, as you've mentioned, we're moving towards an era of armed states, or whether we'll ever see a nuclear détente, an easing of nuclear tensions. But before I delve further into that, and before you answer that, I know Ezra has been waiting anxiously to ask a few questions of his own.
Thanks, Ismail. And thank you so much, Prof, for joining us today. My question has to do more or less with trying to find a way around, nuclear weapons. And it's to do especially with trading. Now, we know that there's many states, I believe South Africa is also one that has uranium reserves. But I wanted to ask if there's any, laws in place, international laws, that prevents trading of these materials.
Right. Ezra, so in our case, we have, of course, stringent laws. In fact, we have the Nuclear Proliferation Council, Non-Proliferation Council, which sits in the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition, that plays this very important oversight between business, government, and our international obligation, especially in what is called dual-use goods. The material and equipment that you refer to that can be used for bombs, but also for peaceful purposes, medical isotopes, for example, food radiation, for example, also. So our trade takes place within what is called the Nuclear Suppliers Group. That is an international organization, or at least a grouping of states that see that trade takes place responsibly. Secondly, we are also part of various other agreements, like the Hague Conduct on Missiles, the Wassenaar Agreement that is also dealing with trade and export controls. Besides that, of course, we are a member of the IAEA that I mentioned earlier, where we have additional protocols and safeguards agreements. And of course, Resolution 1540 that I referred to, where it says that because it's a UN Security Council resolution, all states must adhere to it. Now, through the nuclear regulator in South Africa, we submit reports to the UN Security Council on 5040. We also see that the Nuclear Energy Corporation, Pelindaba, also has regular consultations with the IAEA. And then, of course, within the UN, we play also a role now as one of the co-chairperson of the Conference of Parties of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And also, let us remember that South Africa is the host of the African Commission on Nuclear Energy here in Pretoria, and we play a very important role. That one of our South African diplomats is one of the commissioners that is very much involved in keeping the continent free of this. So to answer your question, we have a lot of uranium reserves. We still have highly enriched uranium from our nuclear weapons program, which is under international safeguards. How much, we do not know. And also, government has, a few years ago, declared uranium as a strategic resource. Given our power crisis in our country, given the fact that uranium is also used for peaceful purposes, our country has decided that we would rather use the benefit of that resource in our country than export it. Now, our nuclear energy policy of 2008, which is still in place, say that we want to enrich uranium for these peaceful purposes. Now, we are almost 20 years down the line of that policy, and we've recently seen some noises made in terms of the new environmental and industrial strategic action plans, where government wants to go ahead to consider and investigate whether a nuclear power capacity is the way to go for us. I hope that has answered your question.
Prof, you've blown us away by stating all of the different commissions and agreements and covenants and treaties. And a question that I can pose, a question that many people ask is, do you think that, as you've mentioned, there's a great lesson to be learned from former President F.W. de Klerk, that South Africa still has a large role to play in international peace when it comes to nuclear disarmament? And probably the solution then would be to have South Africa sit on a permanent UNSC seat. I know it's a question that has raised a lot of controversy, but surely there's no coincidence that our 5 UNSC members are all nuclear-armed states. Perhaps they could learn something from South Africa.
Clearly, and that is one of the ambitions that we must maintain, is to be part of that inner circle. And as you know, since 1994, South Africa has served 3 terms on the UN Security Council. And in my view, we have a good record of our participation thereof. And let us not forget that South Africa in 1945, through General Smuts, was a founding member of the UN, not only the Security Council, but of the UN. So it is very much part of our history. And of course, we have to go on and make international peace sort of an non-negotiable. So we see that South Africa is part of the Ezra Consensus, which is the African Common Position on on UN reform. Sadly, it seems like that reform process that African states have pushed for seems to be in a stalemate. What we also see is that within the UN, there has been high-level panels that is investigating the various options for UN reform. But you can imagine those 5 permanent states that have the veto are not like President Gorbachev or President de Klerk that can easily negotiate themselves out of a position of power. So what we see is that there is, of course, resistance from those countries. But luckily, on the side of the UN General Assembly, who sadly does not have enforcement powers, but is a strong moral voice for the UN, has adopted resolutions where it can now request the UN Security Council to come and explain why vetoes have taken place. In other words, there is a review process then by the majority of international states that can take place. So it is a slow reform process that is going on, but as long as there are conflicts in the world and South Africa keeps silent, then we are to some extent also party to that conflict. And we have a peace mission to fulfill. We have a reconciliation mission to fulfill in our own country. And let us then also use the lessons of history to continue with the peace process in our country. We have seen the large number of political assassinations in KwaZulu-Natal, for example. In the Western Cape province, we've seen a lot of gang violence elsewhere in the country. So we need to have that discussion in South Africa to have some sort of national dialogue. And of course, that will add to our credibility as an international peacemaker. And that is something that we must covet. We have had a number of Nobel Peace Laureates, and we must continue on that peaceful path that we have set ourselves.
Thank you so much, Prof, for this insightful discussion. I only have two questions. The first one actually alludes to our trajectory as South Africa into arming and disarming. Could you perhaps please take us through the reasons as to why South Africa actually ventured into nuclear programs and why it later actually disarmed? And then secondly, alludes to a book review that I came across, I think sometime last week, on Henny van Vuren's book titled Apartheid, Guns and Money, where the author alludes to the fact that there have been some state actors involved in assisting South Africa's nuclear programs. Retrospectively, what could have been the motives for these external state actors in assisting South Africa? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sia. Well, I'm carbon dating myself, so I can remember the Cold War, which, with all due respect, none of you could remember because I think you were not born by then. So we should also look back in our history as very much part of the Cold War. And this is what makes history so important, is that it is always important to go back to history to understand where we are in the present case and hopefully to learn from it. So when we acquired nuclear weapons, that of course was at the height of apartheid. It was the consolidation of grand and petty apartheid. And of course, the international community reacted fiercely about what is happening. Simultaneously, we had the superpowers also engaged in a cold standoff against one another. And a third element of that is that within the Southern African region, within South Africa, liberation forces were active so that the democratic free South Africa that we have today can be achieved. Hence, we had the so-called border war between Southwest Africa, Namibia, and South Africa, Russians and Cubans involved, and of course, the increased sense of insecurity of the apartheid regime at that stage said, but we need to have an ultimate weapon. And that was then one of the motives. But of course, towards the end of the Cold War, end of the 80s, we know that by the early 1985, thereabouts, discussions with President Mandela and the ANC in exile was already taking place. We have seen that there were already informal discussions taking place. So the tide has shifted with the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and of course the withdrawal of Russians and Cubans and the independence of Namibia at that stage. So to come to your question about who and why would states support another state in the development of its nuclear weapons program, given the vast scope that is required and the vast scientific expertise and resources, South Africa at that stage was totally isolated under UN sanctions, under courts, all kinds of international actions comprehensively against South Africa. So what happened? Typically what happened in proliferation cases, countries try then through other means to sidestep that. And incidentally, we've seen at that stage that the ANC in exile was already aware that West Germany was supporting South Africa. There were publications made at that stage by liberation movements that say, but intelligence sources tell us. And what typically happened is that South Africa denied the existence thereof as part of that deterrence, or at least that nuclear ambiguity that nobody will know, but when it is used then, it is a full surprise. So countries assisted South Africa typically because it was to their own advantage. West Germany, as an example, was, as you know, divided between East and West Germany. Of course, for them, it was also existential, with East Germany at that stage under the wing, so to speak, of the greater Soviet Union. And those fears were also real for them. And having support, or at least providing support to another country that is also fighting the Soviet Union, made sense to them. Simultaneously, the US, who trained a lot of our scientists, France assisted us. when we started with the Kuberg nuclear power station north of Cape Town. So when you buy that kind of technology, you enter into a lifelong relationship. So despite those sanctions, these activities take place. And this is the lesson for today, is that states acquire nuclear weapons capability typically not on their own. They benefit from either other countries, other rogue regimes, or for business means, or then through non-state actors. And the discussions that we had earlier, South Africa is committed to a vast number of these measures that it does not take place. And in fact, we continue to be what we call a norm entrepreneur, leading the way of preventing not only states proliferating nuclear weapons and all other kinds of arms, but also to see that other states do not acquire it. And here, our signature of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons remains one of the latest victories, so to speak, in our disarmament history.
So we've been in the discussion and we've been speaking about the realities of the decisions people like President F.W. de Klerk and President Mandela, took to disarm South Africa of its nuclear weapons. And these are not things, this is what you would expect from statesmen such as Mr. de Klerk and Mr. Mandela, thinking of collective interests, collective international interests over just your own domestic national interests. Now, I want to take the conversation back to the Middle East, specifically between Israel and Iran. And I wanted to ask you, Prof, what the dangers of secretive nuclear programs are. We know that Israel and Iran are in close proximity. It's not like Moscow and Washington that are apart, and from the time of launching a missile to the time of impact is you actually have time to make a decision to retaliate or not. Now, with such close proximity between Iran and a country like Israel, what dangers could this pose? And especially since both have secretive nuclear programs, like what dangers could this pose to the region and the world? Yeah.
Thank you, Ezra. Good questions. Ezra, just as a point of correction, so the nuclear disarmament of South Africa took place during the tenure of President de Klerk. So between September 1989 and March 1993. Remember, by that time, President Mandela was free in 1990, but was not part of government. So the whole disarmament process took place outside the ANC and liberation movement. So, but of course, the ANC, President Mandela, is on record for having very early on in their careers and in the established organizational structures have had a strong anti-nuclear weapons commitment. In fact, President Mandela referred to it in the Rivonia trial, his position against nuclear weapons. So once again, building then on the historical record, of course, taking us then further in 1994. So coming back to the Middle East, I see nuclear weapons still as these states' insurance policy. But of course, these states will think twice before they use it because of the proximity, because of the time and the total devastation that a bomb like this or a weapon like this can cause. So I think more realistically, we must be very mindful of other kinds of weapons that can be used. Chemical weapons, which to some extent you can control, sarin, for example, or poisoning of certain areas, or of the conventional type of war that we have seen now in Gaza, in between Israel and Iran, for example, launching all kinds of aerial weapons. So I foresee that because states are mindful of their own damage and their own danger to the use of nuclear weapons, we must be very mindful that science and technology, AI that Shaun referred to, has opened the scope wide for other kinds of weapons. And I'm not saying that we should not focus on the total destruction of weapons of mass killing like nuclear weapons, but we must be mindful of all these kinds of weapons of mass destruction, particularly in the Middle East, because it is such a highly volatile area. And here, once again, the international community must spearhead this. There must be a solution that is acceptable to all the parties. Once again, the South African case provides a solid point of reference, is that opponents can talk and make it work.
Absolutely. And Prof, to wrap it up, if I have a hypothetical question to ask you, if you were the Foreign Affairs Minister in President F.W. de Klerk's cabinet and following his great example of nuclear disarmament and his promotion of peace and diplomacy and negotiation throughout the world, and you were sent to Israel to speak to Prime Minister Netanyahu and to President Abbas, what advice would you give them?
I would firstly say give peace a chance, because that was the calculated risk that was taken in our country. Let's talk and see where this goes. Peace is not a moment. Peace is a process, as we have seen even today in our country. And peace must be also built from within a country. External actors can, of course, help and facilitate discussions and talks and trust building, but it must come from the ground. And here, the Afrikaans word grondwet, for constitution, for me, is so beautiful because it refers to the soil that these ideals comes from. And so the soil that solution must come from is the Middle East. But sometimes one needs foreign eyes to be able to say, but it can work. And this would be, give peace a chance, open yourself for that, have a difficult conversation. The conversation cannot kill you. Guns and conflict will certainly do, and choose the better option and open the door for that.
Give peace a chance. Those are the famous words by today's guest, Professor Jo-Ansie van Wyk of the University of South Africa. She is South Africa's beacon of wisdom in the field of geopolitics, foreign affairs, international relations, and most importantly, nuclear disarmament. And that was today's episode of the Constitution at Work podcast, brought to you by the F.W. de Klerk Foundation. Please follow, like, and subscribe our content on all platforms, Instagram, Facebook, X, and YouTube. This full episode will be brought to you on YouTube in the next coming days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.